All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I have that it's 12:15. Welcome. We're so happy to have everybody here. The first thing is I'm going to throw a link into the chat box. I think people had trouble capturing it last week. It will be sent in a email also. But if it's your first time joining us, this is a survey just to capture some of your information. It is voluntary. We'd like to welcome you all to the fourth session of Nutrition, Wellness, and the Brain. This series is in collaboration between U of I Extension and the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute at University of Illinois. It's designed to connect the community with researchers at the university and provide evidence-based educational programming. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us, and we would love to hear from you about what topics you'd like to learn more about. At the end of this session today, we will put a link into the chat box, and we would encourage you all to fill out the post survey. If you've been attending multiple sessions, you will see that the surveys have been very similar each week, but we have changed up some of the questions. So we do encourage you to fill out the survey. And we're asking for if you have any questions in preparation for next week's topic. Also, if this is your first time on Zoom, there is a chat box. If you have any questions during the program, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. If you're calling in, please hold your questions to the end of the session. Also, since there's so many people on the call, we are going to ask that people keep their videos off. If you accidentally hit your video on, don't worry, I will probably just turn your video off for you. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this series, Corinne Cannavale. Corinne received her Bachelor of Science degree in Molecular and Cell Biology with a minor in chemistry from University of Illinois in 2017. She's currently a PhD student in the Body Composition and Nutritional Neuroscience Lab, where her primary research investigates how memory can be enhanced through diet and exercise. Today's topic is childhood physical activity and brain health. So I'm going to turn it over to Corinne.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Hello.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead.
I'm on to my next thing.
We're going to go ahead and get started. So I just first wanted to put some helpful links into the PowerPoint regarding some questions we got last week on the feedback surveys. So a lot of people have been thinking about the immune system and how to stay healthy while staying at home. So I've included a few articles and podcasts about how nutrition and sleep and staying healthy might benefit your immune system, and kind of debunking some of the myths that you'll see in the media. So these will be available on the online access to all the PowerPoints for you guys to access, or if you want to take a picture of this, and that way you can access these sites to kind of answer some of those questions that we were getting. And now just getting into the content, I feel like I keep bringing this slide back up, but I just wanted to, again, bring up probably my favorite slide that I've made, where we talk about the difference between correlation and causation. So some of the data that I'm going to be showing today is correlational work, and while this is really helpful for us and can kind of help us move forward into building research questions for intervention studies, it does not necessarily mean that there is a causing relationship, and so you can put two variables into a correlation and sometimes get really interesting results. So I used this website called Spurious Correlations, and we found that cheese consumption per capita is correlated with women receiving PhDs. So again, this is not a causing relationship, but it is correlated. So it's just something to keep in mind when you are reading about literature on your own, and kind of as we go through all of these data that I'm going to show. And then just a recap of what we talked about last week with how we study cognitive function in the lab for children. So we study 3 different realms of cognition, primarily in our lab. These are not the only 3 realms that can be studied in regards to exercise. The first one is memory, so it's how well our brain can hold on to information. There are multiple types, short-term and long-term, and this would be really useful for kids when they're working in school, perhaps on a book report or having to remember math facts. So just their ability to hold on to and retain information. Mental flexibility is how well our brain can accomplish multiple tasks. So this is really useful for like our ability to multitask and kind of hold two different tasks in our attention. But it's also useful while completing tasks where you're required to switch between different rules. So if you're doing fast multiplication and division problems, being able to quickly switch between those two rule sets would be really useful for kids. And then the last is going to be attention. So how well our brain can ignore irrelevant stimuli and focus only on what's important and relevant. And so this is really important just for paying attention in class for kids and making sure that they are focused on the important information in front of them. I do apologize. I have a dog, so he is deciding to choose his favorite loud toy as soon as I get on Zoom calls. And then just some definitions moving forward to looking at physical activity and sedentary time. So physical activity is basically activity where our bodies are up and moving and using energy. So this could be exercising or just taking a walk. Any kind of time where our bodies are up and moving and not in like a sedentary position. And so then for sedentary time, when we're talking about any time that our bodies are sitting, reclined, lying down, and basically using very little energy. So they're really not using any energy beyond what is required for normal functioning. And so really anything that's physically active is going to use more than just that basal amount of energy that our body uses. And then just looking at some guidelines for physical activity, because I know I've gotten a lot of questions about guidelines regarding nutrition. So these are just taken from the CDC's websites for physical activity for school-aged children. So basically the CDC recommends that children and adolescents 6 to 17 should be doing 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every day. And so I've included the definitions and the recommendations for aerobic, muscle strengthening, and bone strengthening activities. And then on the handout, if you guys got the email yesterday, and that'll also be available for you guys to access online after today. On the handout, I included some recommendations from the CDC on different activities that can be considered aerobic, muscle strengthening, or bone strengthening activities. So make sure to take a look there to see additional recommendations, but for the purposes here, I just included some examples. So for aerobic exercise, this would be something like swimming. For muscle strengthening, playing on playground equipment, anything that involves like some kind of body weight exercise. And then bone strengthening activities are going to be things like jumping rope, hopping, skipping, doing any kind of exercise or sports that involve fast-paced changes in direction. Just something that really gets kind of the bones strengthened to the body weight and to forces pushing on them. When we look at fitness in the lab, this is done a little bit more quantitatively because we need to have actual measures to be able to compare to cognitive measures. And so we can do that through a variety of ways. One of the ones that are most common is a VO2 max assessment. So you can see the woman that's on the treadmill hooked up to this device on the left-hand side of the screen. And basically here we're asking how aerobically fit is the participant. So we'll hook them up to a machine where we can measure all of the oxygen and CO2 that the person is consuming. And then we'll get them at a nice, comfortable jogging pace and increase the incline of that treadmill until they're working as hard as they can and can't run anymore. So we want them to hit their absolute max amount of exercise exertion that they can. And then based on the amount of oxygen that they're consuming and carbon dioxide that they're exhaling, we're able to determine how aerobically fit that participant is. We can also use measures of self-report activity. So these are done primarily through surveys where we're asking how often you're physically active, what kind of activities that you do to stay physically active, And these can give us a good idea of more regularly how active you are and what kind of activities you're engaging in. And then finally, some labs will use accelerometers. And so these are very similar to like a Fitbit. Some will go around the waist, others will go on the wrist. And basically this will give us an idea of how physically active a participant is over a certain time span that we give the device. So for our lab, we give these out for a week, and we can determine in a typical week how active are our participants. So we can measure steps that they're taking, the amount of time that they're exercising per day, their sleep quality and stuff like that. And so those all can be measured with an accelerometer. And what's really interesting is that in our lab and other labs, we've been able to correlate a lot of these measures of fitness with all of the cognitive measures that I mentioned earlier. So memory, attention, mental flexibility, all have been associated with aerobic fitness. And so these are all really great measures for physical activity for us that do have their pros and cons, but overall do tell us a lot about brain functioning and the association of exercise and brain. I also just briefly wanted to touch on sedentary time. So this is going back to the idea of like how much time that you're spending sitting, reclining, or laying down during the day. And what's interesting about these data, so basically we're looking at the difference between the line with the square and the line with the circle on it. And for boys around grade 3, they were actually finding that their reading fluency scores were significantly different for kids that were spending a high amount of time in like a sedentary position and not really spending a lot of time being physically active. So you can see there's a separation at, because there's a separation at grade 3 for those boys in the top left graph. That's really what we're looking at here. So they are significantly having lower scores on this reading fluency task that was done if they're spending high amounts of time being sedentary. So it's not only important to be physically active, but also to make sure we're reducing sedentary time and staying active during the day, even if we're not exercising. And then back to this other slide that I've talked about a lot over the course of this series, but basically looking at this hierarchy of data that we can look at in human trials. So correlational analyses, while they're really important and they create the foundation for a lot of these, that's why they're at the bottom, they are not as highly indicative of the relationships that we can see as something like a randomized control trial. So a good representation that Kelsey had brought up to me is actually that a correlational analysis is very much like taking a photo of our participants. So they come in at one time point, we collect all of these data, and then we're able to associate things between one another. On the other hand, if we're doing a randomized control trial, we're doing more like a movie. So we have these participants come in, we collect some data, we have them do something over the course of the intervention period, and then we collect their data again after the intervention to see how they changed. So more indicative to a movie, whereas we're doing a screenshot with these correlational analyses. And so this is a really great representation of what a randomized control trial might look like. So we have a group of participants that you can see in this kind of like olive green color. They all are randomized into different groups. So for this study, there were 4 groups. And each group goes through a 9-month intervention period. Some of them might be a control group, some of them might be certain levels of intervention, and then they'll get follow-up testing at the end of that intervention so that we can see how that intervention or not having the intervention affected their scores. And so something like this was done at the University of Illinois over the course of a 9-month period, where kids were enrolled in an after-school program where they were exercising and engaging in physical activity for the entire 9-month school year. So half of the student participants were placed into the physical activity group, and the other half were placed into a wait list where basically they would get to do the trial the next year. And so With this study, they had them come in for pre-testing visits where they did some nutrition surveys, cognitive assessments, health screenings. They did a couple neuroimaging methods where we look at brain functioning and brain structure. And then we also assessed some additional nutrient markers in the eye, like we talked about last week, relating to lutein and zeaxanthin. And then we also did something called a DEXA scan, which allows us to assess like body fat percentage and certain levels of fat in different compartments of the body. And so for this trial, one of the cognitive assessments that they did involved looking at attention. And so this is an example of one of the tests they did. I have some data on the right with the bar graphs that looks at 2 different cognitive tests that they did. But basically, both of the cognitive tasks are looking at how the participant is able to focus on that center arrow and ignore the arrows on the outside. So with this, we're able to measure how well that they're focusing while also ignoring these kind of irrelevant arrows on the side. So you can see that the ones that are labeled as incongruent are going to be slightly more difficult because it's pointing in the opposite direction of those flanking arrows. So it's going to be a little bit harder for our brain to kind of ignore those arrows on the edges. The other task that they did involved like a multitasking task. They were actually switching between 2 different types of stimuli on the screen that had different rule sets. So that's getting more at that mental flexibility that we talked about earlier. But you can see here, looking at the scores for the intervention, that the intervention groups in orange performed better at post-test, and for the accuracy for the flanker task, so the one on the left, and the heterogeneous version of the other task that I talked about, both of them were significantly better than the wait list or the control group. So you can see that the wait list control groups still improved. So I think if you guys can see my stylus, I'm seeing that there is an improvement with these waitlist groups, but the improvement for the intervention is higher. And so that's what we can detect with this little bar between the 2, showing that it is a significant increase in their performance. So they are still getting better over the school year. So physical activity wasn't like the end all be all for these kids. However, they did have more improvement than the kids who were just enrolled in school throughout the year. And then we also did this really cool neuroimaging technique called event-related potentials, where we can see how changes in voltage on the scalp relate to cognitive function. So this isn't necessarily showing activation within the brain, it's showing activation on the scalp. But what's really cool is that we can see that the kids that were enrolled in the intervention have higher levels of activation for the cognitive tasks that they were doing relative to the controls. So you can see that red region on the back portion of the head is indicating that they had basically higher amount of resources being used to complete that task and had a bit more neural activation related to that than to the controls. And then I briefly just wanted to touch on school recess and physical education, just because this is something that is becoming increasingly more prevalent in the United States. Basically, only 8 states, as of May 2019, required daily recess in elementary schools. And recess, as students get older, decreases tremendously. So in elementary school, about 90% of students receive this like daily recess. But as they get to 6th grade and kind of that middle school threshold, that drops drastically to only 35% of students. So it's really dropping off, and it gets even lower in high school for these students. And there is some evidence that suggests that fitness and recess or physical education can improve children's attention and academic skills. So the data are implicating that recess is going to be beneficial for school-age children. However, there's really being a reduction in the amount of recess and physical activity time that kids are getting through the school day. So it's important to kind of keep these things in mind as our kids start enrolling in school and making sure that if they're not getting that physical activity in school, that we find times elsewhere for them to get that. And then I should also mention, I got this information from this school springboard website. They basically are really a suppository for a lot of the information regarding recess and physical education in schools in the United States. And so they're a really great resource if you want to learn more about this. And then just going back to some key points, as we mentioned, aerobic fitness is beneficial for healthy brain functioning in childhood. Higher levels of sedentary time and lower activity may impact academic skills, and school recess programs may help improve attention in children, specifically during the school day. And so with that, I wanted to kind of talk about some ideas that you guys have been employing over the last few weeks in order to stay active at home, especially with your kids. And I included a website here that Extension has for tips on how to stay active at home, but I'd love to kind of have an open discussion for us to talk about some of the ways that you guys are staying active at home and keeping your kids physically active and how that might impact your time working with them and staying at home. So you guys can put it in the chat box, or I think Chelsea can unmute you guys if you're on audio for us to share some of those things.
Yeah, so go ahead and put it in the chat box, how you are staying active. If you have kids at home, or even if you don't have kids at home, what would be some ways that you would think of keeping active right now?
Yeah, so it looks like Luna says that they're dancing and exercise together. So that's a really good idea, especially because I feel like a lot of people think that when they hear physical activity, that means running or, doing some kind of concrete exercise, but like dancing is a really great way to kind of achieve some of that. Yeah, going on walks, walking whenever the weather allows, that's a really great kind of way to get a bit more active and also get out of the house. Let's see, Pop Sugar videos, cosmic yoga. Yeah, this is really great. Dance classes on Zoom. Yeah, I know a lot of places are offering online classes now. Soccer ball, running up and down the stairs. Yeah. Sitting outside for lunch, going out on the back porch to play also sounds really good. Yeah, because even just getting outside and like being out of the house a bit, I'm sure helps too. Walking back and forth to the fridge. Let's see, walking in the park in the neighborhood. Yeah. Oh, planting veggies. That's really cool. Yeah. Nice. Cleaning. Yeah. Yeah. All of these things, like you'll find that like on the website that I put, that's more geared towards children. But like things like cleaning and gardening and stuff like that are still physical activity because you are, up and moving and lifting things and stuff like that. So all really great recommendations. Oh, Xbox Connect. Nice. Yeah, I remember like the Wii Fit used to have stuff like that, but I've never done it on Xbox. Oh yeah, hope that walking out to get the mail, playing with my dogs. Yeah, I don't know how many people have dogs, but I'm sure they're also going crazy. I know my dog is going a little bit stir crazy. Yeah, these are all really great ideas. So thank you guys all for sharing kind of the things that you guys have been doing. Like I mentioned, I included the link for Extension's tips for staying active at home. So I definitely recommend going to that website and kind of seeing how you can incorporate a bit more into your routine if maybe you're struggling to get motivated to be active or just looking for some more ideas outside of what you guys have been doing already. And Chelsea just put that in the chat too, so you guys will have access to that through the chat. These are my references for this week. If you guys are interested in reading some of the primary literature, and I'll open it up to questions, or if you guys want to share any additional ideas for how you guys have been staying active or if you want me to go back to certain slides, just let me know.
While we open it up for questions, I'm going to throw some additional links in the chat box, just for your knowledge. So the first one is the location where you can find all of these sessions. So if you've missed any of Corinne's sessions, we are on week 4, and you can go to this link. It's extension.illinois.edu/global/nutrition-wellness-and-brain. And all of her recordings are there and handouts. So if you're interested in her previous sessions, you can check those out there. We also have a session going on called Discover Wellness at Home. There's a lot of different sessions going on. Tomorrow there's one going to be called Who Gets Grandma's Yellow Pie Plate, about making plans for your items before you pass away. It might sound sad or morbid, but it's really not. A lot of times families fight over items, and this way people have plans for their items so they don't fight over them. And then coming up in May and part of June, we're going to do a Discover Brain Health series. And so I'm going to put the link to that one in the chat box as well. All right, and I'm going to pass it back over to Corinne because people are starting to ask questions.
Yeah, it looks like Kathy was asking for the key points again. So I had put that there, and I can go back to the graphs and summarize those a bit more if you'd like. And feel free to put any other questions you guys have in the chat. Yeah, I also was having an issue with copy paste links from the chat last week.
I will send them in the I will send them out in an email with the handout from this week. Yeah, I will repeat the website. So the website that has all the information from Corinne is extension.illinois.edu/global/nutrition, and then dash or hyphen wellness hyphen and hyphen brain.
Yeah, and like Chelsea mentioned, she'll send those in an email. So if you guys can't copy paste them, then that's okay.
I don't know why that's not available.
Yeah, it wouldn't let me do it last week while I was trying to pull the links that we had talked about last week. So
Yeah.
send an email to Zoom and ask them to make it possible. Any other questions?
And just so everybody knows, in 2 weeks, we'll have our next session, and that is on nutrition and wellness into adulthood, and that is on April 29th. Oh, I need to get the link out. Oh, you're not gonna be able to copy the link anyway, so we will send you an evaluation link in the email. We would encourage everybody to fill out the evaluation. It does have a space where you can ask questions ahead of the session. And so Corinne can answer those or prepare to answer those ahead of time, as well as any additional thoughts or ideas for future sessions. And somebody did ask a question about the registration for tomorrow. That one is the registration for tomorrow is the Discover Wellness series, and it's go.illinois.edu/wellness-at-home, and that's all one word. So go.illinois.edu/wellness Wellness at Home. And tomorrow's is called Who Gets Grandma's Pie Plate? And then next week is Being Mindful During Difficult Times. And then on April 30th is Someday is Today, Live Your Bucket List. Those are the 3 that are coming up in that Discover Wellness series. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We hope you have a great day no matter where you are. It was lovely to see everybody where they were from at the beginning of the session. Take care, and we hope to see you again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody.